and welcome back to the Transracial Adoption Positive or Negative podcast. My name is Xinru Viola, and this is my co-host, my mother.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth, and in this podcast we're going to be looking at the issues around transracial adoption in relation to our own experience. But before we start on the next stage of the process, Xinru would give you a quick update on her trip to China, proposed trip to China.
So currently, I can't remember what happened in the last episode, but I have had an update from my university. I will hopefully be sent my documents soon so I can apply for my visa next week, we hope. And then I will have to undergo a total of 21 days in quarantine.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so I thought it was only 10, but it's actually 21.
God.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking more about the preparation to adopt. So I'll be asking Mum a lot of other questions, and we'll hopefully get to hear about the process she went through to adopt me.
Yes. So where would you like me to start?
Well, right from the very beginning. So once you knew that you wanted to adopt, what was the first step you had to take?
Well, I decided on China, as I mentioned last time, and I did apply to the local authority, but everything took so long. You have to wait for every stage of the process. So while I was waiting for an interview from the local council, I started going to a few lectures, and at the lectures there were often people who had already adopted or were planning to adopt.
So before we go into the lectures, when you say local authority, what do you mean? So you just contact your local council and say you're interested in adopting internationally?
Yeah, the process was you can only adopt in Britain through your local council. We were in London, so it was the local authority there.
And you specify that it's an international adoption?
Yes, and they, as I said before, they absolutely disapprove of it. So I was really dreading going in to see a social worker locally. I knew that they would be trying to, if not trying to dissuade me, at least being pretty negative about everything. So I tried to read up on things. There wasn't much in the library, to be honest, about adoption, but I read a few books, and these lectures were pretty good because they were looking at international adoption and transracial adoption and highlighting all the issues. It was pretty scary. I mean, when you start going to these lectures, they tell you all the things that can go wrong, all the health issues you might encounter, all the corruption that might be going on in some countries, not so much in China at that time. And for example, there was, as I've told you on many occasions, there was this lecturer called Michael. I wish I could remember his surname, but he was a professional psychiatrist who worked with transracial adoptees, not necessarily international, sometimes domestic adoptions that were transracial. And he just made me feel so scared, really, about all the different problems there had been. And his view was it should not be allowed. Transracial adoption should be forbidden. And then he said, but I know a lot of you will go ahead in spite of everything I can say. So I'm going to try and give you some tips about what you can do.
So what was his background?
He was mixed race. He had a black father who I had never known, and a white mother, so he was in effect a black child who'd grown up in a white family. But it was his birth mother and his birth grandparents. I don't know that he'd had a particularly traumatic time, but I think it gave him an insight into what it was like as a non-white child in a white family. He'd obviously done very well professionally, and I really liked him, but he had very strong views about transracial adoption. So he almost put me off because I took very seriously everything that he said. But then the whole of the time that I prepared for and then adopted you and Qing, and all the way through, I really took everything he said very, very seriously. So a lot of the things that I've done have been because of him. So he actually did lectures, and then I even went to a workshop that he did where he got all of us to sit round in groups and talk about how we would bring your child's birth culture into their lives, what you would do about this or that, what would you do in certain situations. So he really worked us all through it. And I had no idea what effect it had on others, but it certainly had a big effect on me. And one thing he said was that you can just go along to another community and just walk in and in effect say, can I be your friend? I know he said it's scary and it may sound like a weird thing to do, but he'd actually run workshops for people who weren't adopting but who just wanted to get to know other cultures better. And I always remember a lovely anecdote he told about an old lady who came to one of his sessions. She wanted to get to know the black community in her area. He had suggested, as she was quite religious, that she go along to a local church on a Sunday, which she did. She went to obviously what was a very evangelical black church, was made so welcome that she carried on going every Sunday. I mean, astonishing.
Yeah.
He was saying she just walked in as the only white person there probably and was made so welcome she loved it. So, and that's a very rosy view of it, but that's what I ended up doing with the Chinese community. So I took very seriously everything that he suggested, as you know. So lectures like that were very, very useful. Lectures about how there may be attachment problems with a child who's suffered any degree of neglect or hasn't had one consistent carer all through their babyhood. Nutritional problems, that was less an issue for China. Most Chinese children were reasonably well fed. But they could be in children's homes where they didn't have enough attention. But I don't know anyone adopted from China who had been so neglected that they were brain damaged, because that can happen. I didn't even know that. Children can die of lack of attention, not lack of food. It would be, could be lack of attention. That's what used to happen in English orphanages in the sort of 18th and 19th century, where you have records where lots of people endowed money into these places, but the children still died in their thousands. It was lack of attention. A child loses interest in life if it can't engage with those around it.
Wow.
You know, so I think all the Chinese children we know must have engaged with their surroundings because they weren't brain damaged, were they, at all? Whereas some of the, was it Bulgarian orphanages at one stage, there were children who had terrible problems because they'd just been left with no attention at all. So your contemporaries must have had attention. And some, like you, were fostered, but many weren't, but they must have had attention, I think. So that was all the work that I started doing, and then I went along to my first interview with this woman in the local authority. She was quite keen, I think, to make the point that I didn't know what I was doing. Are you really going to do this? I said, well, yes, if I can.
Had she seen other people going through international adoptions, or was
Probably.
it you her first?
Not many. She might have, I don't know, she might have seen a few. Because, adoption from China started in a small way in about 1994, I think.
Oh, okay.
And I was being assessed in 1996 to 7. So she must have seen at least one or two, probably.
So it was adoption internationally at that time rare?
Fairly, yes. Well, China had only opened up, and China was the bulk of it. It had only opened up relatively recently. So she said in a very sort of determined way, and have you actually been to China? Clearly expecting me to say no. And I'd, yes. And I just looked at her, it was as if I'd shot her fox. Because she more or less stopped the subject of China then. Because I suspect she hadn't been there, so there wasn't really much she could say. I don't know. She was so obviously assuming I hadn't been. And I'd only been once, but at least luckily I had been. And then she asked me all sorts of things, and in the end she agreed to refer me because the council wouldn't do the assessment themselves. I know they were understaffed, I understand that, but they disapproved of international adoption. So they referred me to an organisation called ChildLink, which I don't think exists anymore, but which did all London's referrals. So then it was a case of waiting again for a preliminary interview with the head of ChildLink, or one of them anyway.
That sounds long already.
Oh, it's such a rigmarole, yeah. So in due course, another month or two, I went to see ChildLink and discussed with them my application. They at least were positive about it. There was no trying to put me off from that point, because that was their job. But I will say ChildLink were not entirely equal opportunities when it came to adopters, because I discovered my whole process took a long time to go through. And I knew two other people that I won't name them, but you and I know very well, a couple and a single, who got fast-tracked through the system.
Really?
Yep. And I think that was grossly unfair. It wasn't clear that was going to happen. We all paid the same amount. It was quite expensive, in a couple of thousand. And I think with the single, it was because she was a Buddhist. Why on earth that was supposed to make her more insightful when it came to adopting from China, I don't know. And with the couple, it was because they'd had a really bad experience with domestic adoption. They'd gone all through the process, been approved, and then, they had been offered a child, but they hadn't really been treated well, shall we say. They hadn't had the right accommodation, they had to move house, and then they didn't get offered a child properly at the end of that. And so they'd had a really traumatic time. But I didn't see that as a reason for fast tracking, because international adoption is almost entirely focused on the racial and cultural needs of the child, and they wouldn't have addressed that with a domestic adoption. So again, I was quite angry about that, but hey, what can you do?
And so does ChildLink just deals with international adoption, or they deal with all the... just international?
As far as I know, just international.
And so all countries, not just
but
China?
They were allowing themselves to make these very subjective judgments about who was a good applicant and who wasn't, and that was annoying. I complained about it. So again, delay, but eventually after about 2 or 3 more months, they allocated me a social worker. I'd done a huge amount of preparation. They send you papers about what you need to think about and write up stuff about. So I'd written sort of essays on every subject they gave me.
What kind of topics?
Oh, it's almost entirely about your own childhood and how you would relate that to how you would bring up a child. So what your home experience was like, attitudes to race, sex, gender, upbringing, religion, the whole shebang. I wrote pages of, I like writing. I wrote loads of stuff because I was still waiting for the referral. I think the poor woman must have, struggled to read all of it. It would have been like reading a small book. So I really prepared. And by the time my lovely social worker, really nice social worker called Kay, was allocated, luckily she was on my side. Some social workers are not. She was on my side. And so I enjoyed the home study. She said,
what is a home study?
Oh, it's just an assessment of your suitability. But it's done over a period of time. And she said, I'm supposed to take 6 months over this, but I can see you're totally prepared. This is on my first interview.
So they just come over a period of 6 months? How
regular,
often?
Yeah, about every week or two that you have a 2-hour session.
Oh, so you just kind of like just a chat?
It's just talking, I mean, they have a quick look around the house, but it's not about the house. It's about you. And, I enjoyed our sessions. And normally they give you homework to do, things to go away and do. But she said,
like what?
Well, go and find the local Chinese community, or go and talk to someone who's adopted, or...
How would you find someone else who's adopted, though?
Well, there are self-help
organisations
such as the ones that I was a member of. You can easily enough find someone, or you could ask the local authority to refer you to somebody. I don't know what people did, but she didn't have any that she wanted me to... I'd really, what I'm like, I'd prepared very thoroughly. So we did these various sessions, and then she wrote up her report, and then I had to wait to go to panel. In those days, the adopter themselves didn't go to panel.
What does that mean?
There's a panel of experts who look at your papers, which are the result of your assessment, and various other checks for health and police checks. Yeah, you have to give a statement of your income and all this sort of thing. And they assess it all and can talk to the social worker. I think these days the adopter would go to the panel as well, but they didn't in my day. So she rang me up afterwards and said, oh, they've approved you. So yes, another wait while the approval is written up, and then your papers go. I'll cut it all short. They went to the local authority, who passed it on to the Home Office, who passed it on to the Chinese Embassy, who passed it on to Beijing, to the adoption department there. And then you were on the waiting list, which at that time was 9 to 10 months for the allocation of a suitable child.
So before it got to this stage, before the documents were in Beijing, how long had you been waiting? How long had that process been?
Over a year.
Over a year? Okay.
Yeah.
So you were now set to wait almost another year?
Well, yes, yeah. It was over 2 years from start to finish. So then you knew you had a long wait. So it was a case of carrying on with all your preparations, getting the house ready if anything needed doing.
But when you say getting all your preparations at this point, is this more doing it on your own rather than, having to go and do it? So some families might not be, doing more preparations. Or...
Yeah, some people probably didn't go to lots of lectures or read lots of books or meet lots of other people, but I preferred to do that. I wanted to get as much information as I could. I also had a couple of, holidays that I could have without a child, which was a nice thing to do. Went to South Africa. And tried to save money. I did lots of overtime. If there was any overtime available, or if I was allowed to do overtime, I would do it at work and things, just to try and get some more money together. And decorated the house because I didn't know when I'd have time to decorate it again. Just silly things like that. So then eventually your referral arrives, and from China it's not a case of any sort of degree of choice at all, apart from what you've specified in your home study, which was...
Yeah. Tell me about what... So when you get this form or whatever about a child, I know I don't know much detail about it, but I know that you can tick what kind of state you'll be willing to take the child in, like if they have any health conditions or anything. So tell me more about that.
Yes. Well, it was interesting in China at the time. Only the first child you were adopted, and assuming that you had no previous children on either side, if it was a couple, you could have a child without any special needs. So I was eligible for a child without special needs. But if you had a couple, say, where one of them had a child 20 years before, they would not at that point be entitled to a child who was not special needs. But special needs was often quite minor needs. It might be being a child who was slightly deaf or had a heart defect that was perfectly easy to correct, or just little things like that, fairly small things. Anyway, I was entitled to be allocated a healthy child. I said I wanted a girl. I did think about it, and I thought, no, I'd rather have the certainty. The chances of getting a boy were almost nil, really, especially as a single woman. But I said a girl. I thought,
you could specify gender.
You could, and of course, in the end, as we know, some people did get boys.
Yeah.
But I don't remember any boys in my era when I got you. But the boys gradually did start to arrive. So I said, ideally, I wanted a child under 9 months, but that I would accept an older child. I don't think I specified an upper limit. I always said to friends, whatever they offer me, I will accept. And friends used to say, well, how can you say that? How can you, if you say you don't want a 2-year-old, how come you would accept a 2-year-old if they... And I said, I couldn't look at the paperwork of a child that needed a home and say no. I just couldn't do it. I would... It's in my nature, isn't it? I would have been haunted for the rest of my life by that. I couldn't have said no. So that's why I was so nervous, because unlike some people, I wouldn't have felt able to say no. And I know myself well enough to know that.
So were you nervous then in the wait?
Terrified.
So one day a letter just appeared in your house, and then that's how you found out?
Yes, with you, I think I happened to be in. I think it must have come on a Saturday, because why would I be in? I would have been at work. It was a knock, and I had to sign for it.
Oh, and did you know what it was then when you had to sign?
I suspected it, because it was around about the right time, and it was a registered package of papers. I suspected it. Opening it. Yeah. Wait a minute, I was going back to say what I'd specified I would accept. I had this long discussion with my social worker, because the UK authorities encourage all adopters to say that they will accept certain disabilities. And I had this long discussion with her, and I said, look, if I'm offered a child with a minor disability, I will accept them, and I can tell you that, and you're welcome to tell the panel that. But I don't want to tell the Chinese authorities, because remember, what I say is going to be translated into Chinese. It can be mistranslated. It can look as though I want these disabilities. I really felt strongly, I don't want to say it, but I give you my word I would accept a minor disability. And I meant it.
What did she say about that?
In the end, I wrote it all out. She said, can you write it all that out for the panel? So I wrote a document for the panel, and they accepted it. I was actually able to say there was one person who'd had their application delayed because they had said they had tried, as a single, artificial insemination, AID, which was translated into Chinese as that she had AIDS.
Oh no!
So the whole thing was delayed until she'd had a test.
Yeah.
So I said, I just don't want to take that sort of risk. So the package arrived. I'm trying to remember what was in it. There were quite a lot of papers. The only photograph it had of you, the baby, was a postage stamp sized photo of the child's face, taken obviously months before you were much younger than that, maybe 6 months old or something. So,
oh really?
Yeah, I knew that this wasn't what you looked like now. Yeah, so there's this little photo. It told me various things about you. It said good health on every category, what inoculations you'd had. Then there was forms to be filled in, details about the procedure. I can't remember all the details, but there's just that one tiny little photo. And it was really a yes or no situation, and I was always going to say yes. So I replied immediately, yes. And that went back through the Home Office to the Chinese Embassy. And
how long did that take
so
from getting the papers to then saying yes? And
I think it took another week or two before I had any news about when I would be allowed to travel. You had to have a paper called permission to travel before you could go to China to get...
In those days generally, or to adopt specifically?
To adopt, yeah.
Oh.
Just to adopt. So I was waiting for that, but it didn't take that long. I can't really remember. But... in the end, I actually travelled without the paperwork because I'd already allocated a guide. From general knowledge, people knew who the guides were that you could have, and I'd signed up for a particular guide. And he had contacts in the Beijing office, and he said, they've sent your permission to travel. If you come to China, that's fine. You don't even need the piece of paper. They won't challenge you at the airport. Come on a visitor's visa. And that will be okay, which seemed a bit of a bold move, knowing the Chinese are very... bureaucratic, but that's what I did. And my sister came with me, and we flew out to Beijing, and it was okay without that paperwork.
So how did you feel about all of that, this whole almost 2-year-long process, and finally going out?
Well, it took longer than I'd hoped, obviously. I was misled, really, by my initial contact with somebody who knew about adoption in China, who said it took under a year, and of course it was well over 2 years. So it was very stressful, and at one point, when I hadn't heard anything for ages, I started to think, has this all been a complete waste of time and it's never going to happen, and waste of money as well. I spent quite a lot of money on it. Is this ever going to happen? Yeah, you do get very fed up with it.
And when you went to go and get me, did you know any other people who had adopted before you? Like, as in personally known other people?
I did, yes. We were still amongst the earliest, weren't we? But there were people who had children maybe 1 or 2 years older than you. So right from the start, I'd met people who had adopted children, but the ones I knew the best were from a self-help group which I set up in West London.
Yeah.
So I think of the people who joined that group, I was the third person to get a child. So I'd seen 2 couples before us who got children, and then lots of others afterwards. So yeah, there was no sort of contact group really in West London, or not near us anyway, for people adopting from China. I'd been to a lovely one in East London, but it was far too far away, and I just decided to try and copy that. So I sent out letters to anyone who was adopting from China or Guatemala or any foreign countries on a list from a group called Oasis, and we all used to meet regularly. So I did get to know people who had children, but the point at which I got you, I didn't know that many well who had already done it for any length of time. So I was really sort of making it up as I went along, really. But during the preparation groups, I made friends with some of the people there, especially one single adopter whom I'm still very much in touch with. And there was a couple from South Asia, living in Britain, British nationality, but who had gone out to their family area. I can't remember which country it was. It may have been India, but I'm not sure. And they'd adopted a child out there because they were infertile. And then, of course, they couldn't bring it back into the country. And yeah, this is what I think it's worth making the point, that it's not just other countries that have very difficult regulations that one falls foul of. This poor couple had had a really rotten time because they weren't allowed just to bring the child back in because Britain didn't recognise adoptions in that country, whichever it was. It had to be done through a domestic adoption. So they were told to come back and do a domestic adoption. Well, and you can see how long it takes to do the domestic adoption. So both of them, this young couple, were there at our preparation groups and, going through all this process while their child was out in India with relatives, and it was a baby and they weren't with the child. I remember thinking, the British authorities are just as bad as anyone else. I mean, that was a cruel thing to do. You feel as though there must have been an alternative. They could have given the child a temporary visa to come in while the parents were assessed, or let the parents be assessed one at a time so the other could be out there with the child or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they will have got through, but the only option to bring the child into Britain was for them both to come home and leave it behind for a bit.
That's crazy.
Really cruel, and probably very damaging to the child's psychology. I mean, yeah, awful. So the preparation groups and the lectures were a very good source of friendship, for those of us. And those of us who were single adopters tended to stick together and get to know each other and exchange, ideas and all the rest of it. That was nice.
So do you think it really helped having that group for you as parents? Mum continued the West London adoption group when we grew up, so I've been around all of the other adopted children in West London who attended my whole life pretty much until we were teenagers. So I as an adoptee can say that I really liked it because we were around all these other children, and it's how I know a lot of adoptees, whereas some adoptees I meet now in adulthood, they don't really know many other adoptees because they haven't had these groups or organisations they can join, whereas I grew up with it, one of these, and we also went to another. So but would you say as parents it must have helped as parents?
Oh yeah. I think everybody really valued it, because we even used to have lectures and things that we arranged at evening meetings and all sorts of things like that. But we really enjoyed having the opportunity to discuss any issues with other parents, both the adoption issues or cultural issues, or just, day-to-day problems or anything like that, really.
And how long before you adopted did you set this up and start having regular meetings?
Probably 1.5 or 2 years before.
Oh, so quite a long time that you...
I really got stuck in a long time before I got you, yeah. Because I felt if I don't do it now, I just won't have any time. And that's true. Once you have a child, you've got no time. To do things, that require a lot of spade work and all that, setting up. So, yeah, I did that a long way in advance, and we all knew each other really quite well by the time I adopted you, yeah. It was really helpful for me to know all these other people.
Yeah, especially as a single adopter, I imagine.
But the funny thing is, when you enter the adoption world, you meet all sorts of people who are very different from you, people that I wouldn't have normally met because they're not part of my normal circle, or even the sorts of people I worked with. So, as you know, I'm sort of centre-left politically. I'm not religious. I have quite firm views on all sorts of things. Most of my friends tend to broadly be in the same area as me. I do have some Christian friends, but, you know, I mix, as most people do, with people who have similar views. And I suddenly found myself in the adoption world with people of very different views in some cases. There were people who were quite old-fashioned and traditional in their view and didn't hesitate to express that view. So they thought it was awful, you know, that mothers were out at work. They might not be nasty.
Really?
Well, they might not be nasty about it, but they would...
What, like couples or men? Or
Well, both, but you know, they would often imply that a child that had to spend time in nursery was, you know, to be pitied. They were often quite involved with their local church, and so they might have quite a prescribed view of the world, and sometimes politically very different. I had two different people I liked, who said that they didn't believe that anyone who was gay or lesbian should adopt. None of my friends would ever have said that.
Yeah.
Not because of me. I'm not gay, but they would have. None of my friends would ever have said that, and I just was really astonished when people would come out with this, and I really offended one by challenging her. I said, "Well, look, we're expecting the world to understand that we are going to adopt a child of a different race from a different country who will look different from us. You know, we expect the world to accept that. And you're saying it's not fair for a child to be adopted by a lesbian couple, or a lesbian at all, really, because it would get bullied or would feel different." I said, "Our children are all going to feel different." And she was really shirty with me about it. That's completely different, you know. She was really annoyed with me, I could tell. Me, putting my big foot in it and preaching.
But she shouldn't have been saying that.
No.
Even if she thought it. For all she knew, you could be a lesbian.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
I thought at the time, how does she know I'm not? Perhaps she didn't care.
Maybe it was an indirect comment.
I don't think it was. I really liked her, but people can have some very strange views. I think people are much less likely to have those views now, but I think they're still around, aren't they, those views? I would imagine. Yeah. So a lot of adopters in those groups, you soon find out, a lot of them completely dismiss all the arguments that the local authority force you to discuss and tell you about. They would say, "Oh, once you've adopted a child, it's just your child. You bring them up in your way. They won't care about culture. They won't care about race. They won't care about who their birth parents were." People have these very entrenched views. You probably wouldn't hear it because you're adopted, and so people mightn't say it to you in the way they would to someone who wasn't. But people have some very strange entrenched views, dismissing all those issues. And there were a lot of adopters who were like that. I remember being quite shocked because I'd taken on board everything that Michael was saying, and so again I was quite shocked. And I would often, you know, contradict what they were saying, and I would offend people. I offended a lot of people, I know. And I probably should have been a bit more tactful, to be honest. I know that. But, you know, once I feel something's really important, I find it hard to keep quiet and just accept
I know.
other people's different views. So, yes, there were a lot who were saying they weren't planning to go back to China, they weren't planning to... You know, someone would say to me, "Don't you think you'll just give them hang-ups if you keep going on about China?" And I used to think...
What?
I don't know. Yeah.
But the child would look in the mirror and see that they're Chinese.
I know.
Every day.
I know. I know.
Yeah, it's odd.
Yeah.
But do you think that's also... Do you think maybe these people who had those views back then may have changed their views now? Not just because they've seen their child grow up, but also because, I guess in modern day we're more open about these kind of issues.
Yeah, I don't think even 25 years ago, in educated circles, it was a racist world. Not really. I think people did understand about culture, but well, let me tell you what happened when the first time I went to the Chinese centre where we lived. I went in, explained about the adoption. They're very nice, and I said, so therefore, it was really a case, you know, as with Michael, walking in and saying, "Please, can I be your friend?" And I was saying, I want.
Wait, sorry. Rewind. So, You found out where the local Chinese community centre was.
Walking distance from the house.
Yeah, so you just decided one day, randomly on, a Saturday or something, you just walked straight in.
I found out when they were open, which was on a Saturday, of course. And yes, I walked in. Hi. My name's Elizabeth. They all stopped talking Cantonese and started talking English. And I explained the whole situation. And they said, we had someone in a year ago who was going to adopt from China. We never saw them again. They just popped in.
that homework? Their homework?
Having their home study. Yeah. I said, what I want to do, if it's possible, is to bring my, when I get a child, bring her here so that she can have regular contact with Chinese people. The reaction of a couple of people who meant it in a very friendly way and who I got to know later on was, well, she's only going to be a baby. Why do you want to do that? Just take her home and bring her up like you. She won't know any difference. She's a baby. And a lot of people I know would have thought, well, that's the advice of the Chinese community. That must be correct. And that wasn't my view. I said, yes, well, thank you very much, but can I still bring her here? Yes, well, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. So, yeah. So that was part of the preparation that I did. I knew them really well by the time I got you.
Yes, I was going to say, so after you initially introduced yourself, how often did you go back before adopting me?
I would have liked to go every Saturday, but it was awkward because, they were all talking Cantonese. If I walked in, they had to talk English. And why should they have to do that? I didn't know anyone. I didn't know any mahjong. I didn't know all the other various things they were doing.
Why didn't you learn mahjong?
I hate that sort of So I used to call in about once a month for a few times. And then one day they were having a meeting. They didn't have anyone to take the minutes. And they did have one or two white British who came to the meetings because it was at a church which was renting them at a low rent, I believe, the hall. And the authorities of the church, very nice people, were very much involved. So there were a couple of them who used to come to these monthly meetings. So the meetings had to be held in English. So I said, do you want me to take the minutes? Because I'm very familiar with taking minutes. It's something I can do very easily. Of course, I couldn't have done it if it had been in Chinese, but it was in English for the sake of these others. And everybody spoke English to a greater or lesser extent. They would have jumped at it, of course. Everyone always jumps at anyone who'll take the minutes.
Yeah, I hate doing that.
So from then on, I was the minute taker. So it gave me an intro to the community. I then knew from taking the minutes what was going on. I got to know all the people around the table. So I certainly went to those meetings, and that was once a month. I can't remember whether I used to go at other times. I mean, if they had an event, I would definitely go. I went to Chinese New Year celebrations, Christmas meal.
Even before adopting?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Anything that was on that I could go to. I just didn't want to be a nuisance, They did say to me, why don't you join the choir? But that involved singing in Cantonese. They did have a white bloke who did it because he fancied... fancied one of the women in the choir. So
but I think they got together in the end.
They did for a while.
Yeah.
So
he was a good singer, though.
He was famous for singing in Cantonese. Yeah. So I said, no, I don't think I can sing. Since then, I have taken up singing a bit, but
not in Cantonese.
Not in Cantonese, but I didn't sing at all in any language at that stage. And they were all good. So there's no way I was going to make such a fool of myself. But yeah, so I really knew them, quite well as acquaintances / friends, and they were always very interested to hear how I was getting on with the application and when I was going. And
what was their reaction when you found out? You had the picture of me. Did you take the picture? And
yes, I did. Yeah, quite excited. Obviously, I think they, like a lot of people, have been quite sceptical about whether it was ever going to happen, really, because these were all Hong Kong Chinese, almost without exception, and some of them thought it was a really scary thing to do. You could see in their faces they're going, that they thought you were walking into the dragon's mouth, going to mainland China to get a child. I remember that. Some older women, who perhaps, in inverted commas, escaped from China into Hong Kong. They thought I was really putting my head on the chopping block, and I sort of felt that a bit myself, because it was an authoritarian, well, still is really, but an authoritarian government in Beijing. And I thought, my God, I'm giving them the power to make or break me, as it were. Yeah, so they were very interested in it all. Of course, I took you into the Chinese centre since I got you, but that's probably a tale for another occasion. So you've heard all about the preparations I had to make for over 2 years, right up until I travelled to Beijing to adopt you. Obviously, you knew nothing about it at the time. How do you react to that now? Is it interesting? Do you think it was an adequate assessment and preparation, or what?
Well, I think you all as parents went through a long, lengthy process. Can't imagine 2 whole years, like the anticipation, all of those interviews, and just waiting and just not really knowing when it was going to happen, if it was going to happen, what the child would be like. So I think that's stressful, very stressful, especially as a single parent. You've got no one really to lean on. But I think that based on what you've said, I think it's good that they had a fairly rigorous home study where they, you had a social worker assigned to you and they regularly interviewed you. They really wanted to I think it's really good they wanted to understand the parents' childhood and upbringing to see how that might match and correlate to how the adopted parents would then raise their own children. So I think that's good. And I think you, on your own volition, going to these workshops and these presentations about specifically transracial adoption, I think that's really good. But I think maybe while in the home study, they're getting the adopted parents to think about certain issues like race, and they have these discussions just between the social worker and the adopted parents. Maybe it's better for them to make it compulsory, aside from doing their own little homework assignments, but actually joining these wider groups or workshops where they have they hear from a wide range of people and other parents who are going to adopt, where you all have a bigger discussion amongst yourselves about these issues, because otherwise it's kind of just like an echo chamber between the social worker and the adopted parents, and that's the only views they kind of really hear. Maybe it's better for them to have to go to regular sessions with a bigger group of people where they're forced to think about these questions all together, where there's maybe 10 plus of you, and then really thinking about these things. And that's not to say that there's a right way or a wrong way to think, but just to get them thinking about other ways that they might not have thought about before, or other things that they might not have considered. I think that's probably better for that to be compulsory, because as you say, some people had these fixed ideas of, they're just a baby, what does the baby know? It doesn't really matter about them being from this other country, doesn't matter that they don't look like us. Not necessarily to say that I think that they should think a different way, although I personally do think they should. But I'm biased as well. I think I am definitely biased with my own upbringing, but I do think that these people who had such strict views should have been allowed to be exposed to other views and have been questioned and pushed to consider other views more than they probably were in their 2-year process.
I agree, and that's how I felt at the time of the assessment, that they should have been pushed more if they had those views. But over the years, I've come to the conclusion that probably the social workers and Michael himself and various other people, they know you can't force it. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And that probably if they're not going to believe it, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And they will just talk the talk because they have to, and then they just won't do it. It's a well-known thing, I think, in adoption circles, not just international adoption, but every sort of adoption. People will say what they think you want. And there's one classic example, which I've always said to you, haven't I, which is everybody, and I mean everybody, said they were definitely going to take their child back to China, probably more than once during their childhood. And in my experience, over half didn't.
Yeah.
They said it, probably meant it at the time, but a lot of them didn't do it. And I'm sure social workers are not stupid, they know. They're very cynical, actually, social workers. I suppose they've seen the dregs of humanity so many times. They think everyone's going to lie. That's my impression.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised, because I was going to say during the process, writing these essays and things, who's to say that they're not lying about either their childhood, their upbringing, the way they plan on raising the child?
Yes.
They could all just be these lies.
I didn't lie at all. I couldn't have... Oh, hold on, I did once.
Well, it's all coming out now.
It wasn't when I was being assessed for you. It was when I was being assessed for Ching Ching.
What did you lie about?
Well, the first time she said...
Oh, the first?
With you. You're the first one. You're the first one.
I mean, the first lie.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about this. Gosh, yes, I did lie. Not the first time, though. So the first time, very early on in the process, the social worker said, have you told your family? And I hadn't. So I said, no, I haven't. And she told me that I had to do it. So that was the homework I had to do. And the reaction wasn't that positive. I mean, you can understand, can't you? Can you understand that?
Because at that time, they probably thought, what, China? Why would you go all the way over there?
Yeah, or adoption
What
as a
is it?
single person. I mean, Jack, for some reason, was convinced that a
Your
woman
father?
can't do it. Yeah, my father was convinced a woman couldn't do it on her own, and he kept talking about me not earning enough money. Well, I had greater than the national average income. I mean, that's fine. I wasn't rich, but of course I could do it on my own. Most single parents have a lot less money than that. Yeah, so I told all these people, and I was feeling, I take things very much to heart, and so their sort of negative, in some cases negative reaction, in some cases not very positive reaction, really bothered me. And so when it came to my second adoption, she asked me if I told everyone, and I went, yes. I hadn't.
Oh, you hadn't told them that you wanted a second?
No.
No. Really? So when did they find out?
Oh, I told them in plenty of time, but I didn't tell them right at the beginning, because it takes over 2 years.
Yeah.
I thought, I don't want 2 years of aggravation. I'll tell them 6 months beforehand.
So you told them once you actually knew Ching, the baby, who the baby
No,
was?
it was before they allocated the child. No, I did lie, and I'm not a liar. I'm not a liar. But I just thought they have put me in an impossible position, so I'm not going to tell my parents until I have to.
But do you think they would have been negative again?
No, but they would have thought it was too much. They were delighted with you. They thought everything was great, but they would have been much more concerned with the expense and the difficulty as a single parent with 2. Everybody thought I was bonkers.
Well, when they found out you wanted 2?
To get 2, yeah. I think they thought I was a bit pushing my luck with 1, but completely bonkers to get a second one. And I just thought, no, I'm going to tell them when I'm ready. And I'm not going to have social workers tell me what to do. So on that one issue, I lied. But I felt that it was an unfair question. Because I knew for sure that they would be very nice, and they were, weren't they?
Mm.
I knew they'd be absolutely accepting of it when the time came. Yeah, so I'm a liar too.
Well, on that note, that wraps up the talk about the preparation to go and adopt. And in next episode, we will talk more in detail about Mum actually flying to China and the whole process of actually being out there, adopting me and bringing me back. Yeah.
So thank you for listening. See you next time.
Bye.